Chapter 8 of Clearing Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Clearing Weather by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 8. Silver Trumpets. If Nicholas's eyes could have pierced that mystery which lay hidden beyond the horizon, he would have seen the Jocasta in the first portion of her voyage faring prosperously southward. The heavy winds of autumn bore her swiftly, so that she reached Charleston even before the appointed day. While the waiting cargo was being loaded, Michael made a hasty, mud-splashed journey to his brother's house on the plantation which had so long been home. The delighted, grinning negroes came crowding about to welcome him. His old mammy wept with the pleasure of seeing young Marsers in his own place again, then wept once more at hearing that it was only for a day. "I don't hold no ways with these yea ships," she lamented. "Nobody never came to no good by trifling around water." Michael's brother greeted him wholeheartedly, and the two sat that evening in the big parlor, each in his accustomed seat, and talked of cotton, of how Clayton Hawkins had done well with a new process for curing tobacco, and how big Jason, the best field hand, had been hurt by a viciously kicking mule. The conversation ran out finally, and the two sat without speaking for a long time, until the older brother burst out with a paraphrase of Mammy Sophie's words. "I don't like this seafaring business, Michael. It isn't the thing that our people do. You are not even captain of your ship." "A man doesn't take command of a vessel in his first voyage or two, even if he is a Slade of Berkeley County," returned Michael cheerily. He went on in more serious tone. "I can see what important work there is for such men as you, how great your share is in helping to build up the country. Yet what work is there here for me? A plantation has one head and 100 or so pairs of hands. I am not the head, and I cannot be the hands. I've had to find out some work for myself that will make me feel that I am part of the great things that are going forward in our time." His brother shook his head with less disapproval than before, but still with no very great comprehension. "You always were a fellow for picking up strange ideas, Michael, but I suppose you must go your own way. I'll own that it is a good thing for me to have my cotton and tobacco go to market at last, even if it has to be in a Yankee-owned vessel." Early next morning Michael set off again, with some tuggings at his heart for the place where he had spent such a happy boyhood, but with even greater impulse to be pressing on toward the success of his new venture. "I wish Nicholas could see all this," he thought as he rode under the live oaks and the autumn-colored eucalyptus trees, and galloped along the turnpike toward Charleston. In company with Etienne Bardot he had visited the West Indies more than once, so that the Windward and the Leeward Islands, the harbors of Jamaica and Port-au-Prince were as familiar to him as Pimlico Sound and the Virginia Capes. Since the English lords of government were still displeased with those colonies which had come of age and entered upon life for themselves, they had forbidden American ships to trade, save under iron-bound restrictions, with the British West India Islands. It was to French, Spanish, and Dutch ports that the Jocasta must lay her course, so that she presently dropped anchor in a broad bay with rugged mountains behind it, and Michael sat down to write to Nicholas that they were safely arrived at Port-au-Prince. Even before he was ready to go ashore, Michael was sought out by an old acquaintance, Monsieur Raoul Le Roquet, the most careful, thrifty, and successful merchant in the French islands. He was carried out to the Jocasta by a boat's crew of polished ebony rowers, and was brought into the cabin for a talk upon trading matters and other things. During his year on the Deux Frères, Michael had learned to speak French easily. Captain Douglas understood it less well and sat following the conversation, but joining in it but little. Their first words were of Etienne Bardot, through whom the merchant and Michael had originally met. "A bold man with dangerous ideas," commented the little quick-eyed Frenchman, sipping slowly and carefully the glass of wine which had been set before him. "But Etienne is one who strangely holds a friend's heart, none the less." "Perhaps France and the world also has need of dangerous ideas at certain times," Michael suggested. Monsieur Le Roquet replied with an exclamation of horror, yet with a smile breaking through it. "Do not lead me away into discussion of the strange new thoughts which go winging all over the world in these uneasy days," he said. "Let me see your cargo list, that I may help you to the best disposal of your goods. I fear you have come at a difficult time, but we will do all that we can." All men who have to do with trade, especially commerce by ships, learn early that market conditions are as fitful and variable as the breezes upon which seaborne traffic must depend. Sometimes there will be great demand for some single commodity of which there is no large supply. Then, in the course of brief time, the lack will be filled up and the price will have fallen almost to the ground. A man setting forth with a cargo-laden ship had need for all his wits in disposing of his goods, in deciding where to sell them, what to buy in exchange, and whither to carry the new lading so that the long, profitless miles of sailing from north to south, or from east to west, should be crowned with final reward. It was always the faculty of the American traders, if they did not find profit in one port, to seek it in another. Monsieur Le Roquet made clear to the two Americans how matters stood in the island markets. Their salt meat and fish, their shoes, hides, candles, and cheese would sell to fairly good advantage. I myself will take so and so much, he declared. Monsieur de Rome of Port-au-Prince and Basse-Terre will want so much more. This person or that, so he laid out, would take the most of their coarser goods. The offer was fairly good, better so Michael knew than any bargains which his inexperience could have made alone. And the rice and cotton would, so they were told, fetch quite amazing prices. Bales of woolen cloth, red, blue, and gray, Monsieur Larocque read and shook his head. Ah, no, what use can they be in the islands? Those you will have to carry farther, but you have already chance of great return by selling practically your whole cargo here. It happened, as he made plain to them, that just those products of which the islands were usually full were this season almost entirely lacking on account of a year of bad harvests. French ships, which had come out to purchase cotton, sugar, and rice, were on the point of going home in ballast rather than pay the ruinous prices which such commodities were bringing. I know a captain from Bordeaux who will clasp you in impassioned embrace if you offer to sell him your cotton and indigo, declared little Monsieur Le Roquet. What he will offer you should yield you greater profit than you could ever get by carrying it to France yourselves. Captain Douglas nodded over this information. We can forego the pleasure of the embraces if he has solid gold or silver to buy with, he observed. At the end of the list, the Frenchman looked puzzled over the final item. Fine linens? Those are goods which I have never seen one of your vessels bring to us before. Michael went to fetch one of the rolls of fair white weaving entrusted to his care by the maidens of Brascombe. Monsieur Le Roquet's eyes fairly glistened as he ran his slim fingers over the perfect surface. There are certain great ladies of these islands, French and Spanish, sighing for the luxuries of their own land, who will lay eager hands upon such beautiful stuffs as these. No dark fingers of bondswomen ever wove such webs, he declared solemnly. My dear friend, were it not for my regard for you and Etienne, the merchant in me would swallow up the man, and I would take all that you have of this for a sum which you would call generous, but which would actually be only the half of what it is worth. I will, however, yield to no such temptation, and will call in some others for whom I have high regard to share in this great opportunity. We will decide amongst us what is the just price to offer you. Ah, how the smugglers will be fighting for these bales a little later to carry them into the British Islands. Here lies by far the most valuable portion of your cargo. The conversation moved on to other matters, and Captain Douglas, who professed no knowledge at all of trading affairs, joined in the exchange of those miscellaneous items of news which ships and sailors carry from port to port. The whole talk amongst the islands at present, the seafaring gossip which seems to travel more swiftly than a ship can sail, was of a certain vessel of New England, whose owners, so the Frenchman declared frankly, must be entirely out of their wits, and whose captain must be a sadly misguided fellow. Michael had heard, indeed, certain reports before he sailed of this ship, the Columbia of Boston, owned by a group of wealthy merchants and sent out upon a venture into a destination only rather vaguely defined. Here, amid the teeming commerce of the West Indies, however, news of her errand had been seized upon with the liveliest interest, and talk of her voyage, with speculations as to its results, had become almost the sole topic of sailors' and merchants' conversation. She, with her consort, the sloop Lady Washington, had touched at Port-au-Prince a month or two before, and had from there headed southwestward with the avowed purpose of rounding the Horn and following the long west coast of the whole American continent. She proposed to trade for furs with the Indians in some vague region in the neighborhood of the world's end, so the Frenchman expressed it. These furs she was to carry to China to exchange them for Eastern goods, silks, spices, and teas, which she would carry home by the Cape of Good Hope. Mad, mad, the whole scheme is of lunatics, was Monsieur Le Roquet's summing up of the entire scheme. Cannot a ship's company be content with a properly laid-down voyage to and from some familiar port, instead of roving and questing all about the earth to come home empty-handed at last, or never to return at all? Why, their crews will carry them over the circuit of the whole earth. Captain Douglas, who had been following the conversation rather heavily and slowly, suddenly brought down his hand with a great blow upon the table. "Clean around the world," he cried. "Now that is a real voyage worthy of a fine ship." There was a gleam in his eyes which Michael had never seen there before. He had considered his commanding officer somewhat deliberate and stolid, and had found him so saving of speech that they had exchanged only the smallest number of views on any subject. He began to realize all at once that here was one whom it took long to know, and who had greater depth of thought and feeling than he would ever show, save unawares. The small Frenchman was still voicing words of disapproval over the rash undertaking of the Columbia. Such foolhardiness belongs to a young country and untried sailors. Old seamen would know better. No good will come of such wild adventuring. Captain Douglas listened without immediate comment, and, when he spoke at last, seemed to bring the words from the very depths of his heart. "I have often desired a certain thing," he finally declared. His curious, slow, but deeply glowing enthusiasm was visibly waxing greater, and little by little was changing entirely his square, sober face. "I have often wished that I could have lived a few 100 years ago, in the age of discovery, at the moment when, so it must have seemed to the eyes of all in that crowded, jostling, war-seething Europe of yours, as though a fog had suddenly lifted, showing them vast new continents spread out, all clear and shining in the light of brilliant opportunity." He looked across at Michael, whose kindling glance matched his. But little Monsieur Le Roquet rose suddenly from his chair. "What talk we have drifted into, we who sat down to speak of beef and candles!" he cried, and turning very abruptly upon Captain Douglas, he admonished sternly, "You are of sufficient age to know better. Do not lead this young man's thoughts astray." Whereupon he made his farewells and was gone. Michael, returning from the deck where he had witnessed their friend's departure, found Captain Douglas sitting in the same place with the same far gleam in his eyes. He looked up at the boy as he stood for a moment in the door. Each seemed to read the other's thought. "Michael," cried the captain in a tone almost of alarm, "do not permit your mind to run upon such matters. Let us, as that wiser Frenchman said, let us not lead each other astray." Never before had he spoken to his junior save as Mr. Slade, and with the utmost of shipboard ceremony. Michael grinned as no subordinate should smile at his captain. "We will do nothing without due thought," he said. "There is no need to decide at just this day or hour. But at what season is the weather best for doubling Cape Horn?" "At almost this season," Captain Douglas muttered unwillingly. "It is summer below the tropics now, and in 2 months or more from this time—" He dropped into silent dreaming, then suddenly roused himself. "We have nothing with which to trade with Indians. We have no notion what it is they desire." "I chance to know a little of Indians," Michael returned, "of the Seminoles, far removed from those dwellers in the Northwest, but still of the same race. Even they have told me that, in certain matters, all red men are alike. They are much like children, yet children who must support and defend themselves in the world. To remember that it is to understand how to trade with them. As it chances, we are in the way of disposing of our whole cargo in the first port, all but certain bales of blue and red cloth, and the savage has a pleasant eye for gay colors." With a certain fierceness, Captain Douglas answered him. "And can we voyage, nobody knows just how many thousand northward miles, with a few rolls of colored linsey-woolsey as cargo?" "No, but we can purchase other goods. We can weigh the matter," cried Michael joyously, and went still laughing out upon the deck. There followed some days of bargaining, arranging, and putting goods ashore. Monsieur Raoul Le Roquet was as good as his word, and brought others of his calling to buy what he himself could not use. Not even the hardest and most experienced of them was able to keep his face quite unmoved when the webs of linen were brought out. More than one, after the bargain had been concluded, declared that such a purchase was the opportunity of a lifetime. Several of them had smaller establishments at other and less important islands, and stipulated that the Jocasta should carry thither the portion of her cargo which they bought, and should land the goods at such little ports as Basse-Terre, Marie Galante, and Fort de France. This Captain Douglas and Michael readily agreed to do, since there seemed as yet no prospect of their taking on a new cargo. A goodly number of Spanish silver dollars, stowed away in stout kegs like herrings, had been realized from the sale of the northern wares, but over the prevailing ruinous prices of the commodities they had meant to buy they were still debating, and had so far purchased nothing. Of the Columbia and her voyage those two said nothing to each other directly. Yet one evening as they stood on deck together, Michael suddenly burst out, "I think that there are no names out of the past that ring with such poetry as those of the great explorers. Da Gama, Cabral, Magellan." Captain Douglas took him up at once. Frobisher and Drake he added to the list, and earlier yet those Vikings with open boats and rows of oars, with a steerboard at the side instead of a rudder, and no bearings to follow, only the chance gleam of a star. They did not enlarge upon the conversation, for Captain Douglas walked hastily away, as though he were afraid of what his impetuous, red-haired junior officer was leading him into saying. Hardly more than 7 days after casting anchor in the harbor of Port-au-Prince, they cleared again for Basse-Terre, feeling their way with care out along the reef-fringed Cape Dame Marie. It was a still tropic evening, hot and almost breathless, with a vaguely uneasy sea. With slow caution the Jocasta came finally free of land, and made ready to swing into the open reaches of the Spanish Main. Timothy Tripp, at the end of his lookout watch aloft, came scrambling down to seek Michael. "There is something you should not miss, sir," he declared, "but make haste before the light fails." Michael clambered aloft behind him, not with the monkey-like agility for which Timothy Tripp was famous, but with sufficient speed to mark him as a seasoned sailor. Once upon the cross-trees, and following the direction which Tripp indicated across the uneasy water, he caught sight of the two vessels which the little brown sailor-man had so greatly desired that he should see. The most distant was a small lugger, dingy of paint and of canvas, but evidently from the speed with which she cut the long easy swells, a keen sailor. She had only just slipped out from the shelter of the long tongue of land, which was the last far-reaching finger of the rock-knuckled island of Haiti, which among many still went by its old Spanish name of Hispaniola. She had put off from the French portion of the island, although she had probably not loaded her cargo at Port-au-Prince, but had taken it aboard in some small hidden harbor on the south coast, and, with intent to make use of the covering darkness, had cleared just before sunset and was standing away for Jamaica. "She is a smuggler," declared Timothy Tripp gleefully. "Every line of her would tell a man that. And she must be an old offender, for the cutter has taken after her without a word of summons or a signal to heave to." The larger vessel, a stout cutter of British build and rig, was plainly one of those ships of the Royal Navy whose duty it was to patrol the coasts of the British Islands and see that contraband goods were not landed anywhere in the multitudes of lonely, rocky harbors which nature seemed to have designed for the special convenience of the free trade. "King George keeps his men busy," commented Tripp, "with all his orders that French and Spanish, and most of all American ships must not land goods in his ports. They say the poor black folk on the British Islands are fair starving for the food the Yankee vessels used to bring them. There's a few of them at least will eat their fill tomorrow, for I doubt not it's part of our own cargo that's sailing away yonder to Jamaica. The lugger is loaded heavy, but the king's cutter is not going to catch her." As the smuggler's boat came clear of the last reef, she caught full what breeze there was and ran straight before it, since it carried her directly upon her way. The cutter, which had veered so close to the French shore, evidently with certain knowledge that forbidden goods were on their way to Jamaica that night, now fell into the lugger's wake and settled down to a straight contest of speed. One sail after another went up on the British boat to catch any faint breath of breeze which might waft her the more quickly. Michael had never dreamed that one small vessel could carry such a cloud of canvas, such a multitude of unfamiliar sails. "That's her water boom that she is running out," Tripp told him as she spread an extra spinnaker-like wing in addition to the ordinary expanse of canvas set for running before the wind. "And they call that an angel's wing," he told Michael further, as an oddly shaped topsail appeared above the others, where it scarcely seemed there were space for another inch of bellying canvas. The last light of blue and pink and amethyst touched the wide-winged vessel as she drew away upon her determined race. The lugger had also put out an expanse of canvas whose different sails Michael could scarcely distinguish, and of which he would hardly have known the names. Smuggling from island to island in light tropic airs or in ruthless tropic hurricanes was an art unto itself of which he had little knowledge. "Do you think the Englishman is not going to overtake her?" he said to Tripp. The small sailor hanging upon the yard was watching in an ecstasy of delight the closely contended race. "Each one is just as good a sailor as the other and has as good a skipper," he answered. "Do you mark how each one edges and veers so that not a single sigh of this lazy wind shall escape her? They will race clear to Jamaica with just that space between them, but when they get off the island the little one will find some way to give the big one the slip in the dark." It seemed the most possible thing in the world that the lugger was in truth carrying their own goods away to British ports where American ships were not allowed to trade. Her hold was probably crammed full of the barrels of salt fish and sides of bacon from New England, and had not Monsieur Raoul Le Roquet said quite openly, when he bought their linens, that English households amongst the islands, as well as French and Spanish, would have the final use of them? Even now those carefully wrapped bales were almost certainly stowed away below her deck, guarded by hairy men with gold rings in their ears, with knives and pistols, first cousins to those buccaneers who used to call the Spanish Main their own. How little could any of the sheltered maidens of Branscombe have thought of the bold voyages which their wares would make! It was not so out of place to think of daring little Dolly Drury's possessions being carried on this romantic chase. After all, Dolly had been wholly right about the value of the feminine contribution to the cargo, right in that accidentally sagacious way with which women sometimes guess correctly about things of which they know nothing. Dolly would love to be watching that race and to understand that the work of her hands was the prize. But Michael thought of Henrietta Sparrow, thin, sour-faced, and precise, sitting in her bare, tidy New England kitchen, spinning and weaving like some meager, indefatigable spider. Perhaps it was her long-hoarded wealth which was flying now over those smoothly rolling waters, whose prismatic colors were like the inside of an oyster shell. Here were men risking their lives in romantic and desperate adventure of which her narrow soul could never have dreamed. Some similar thought evidently was filling the captive heart of Timothy Tripp. 17 years, he said reflectively. 17 years she has put me by to get ready for her marriage day, and it is most likely that yonder goes the whole of what she has gathered, all of what she has made me wait for through this whole enduring time. I hope the boat goes on the rocks," he pursued vindictively, "and the whole treasure sinks to the bottom, and the mermaids deck themselves out with those everlasting fathoms of white which she was always weaving." He heaved the great sigh of a loyal but long-tried lover. Ships and winds and waves, they all have strange ways of their own, but a man may know them by heart and backwards before he begins to understand a woman. "But she is going to marry you at the end of the voyage," Michael insisted. "Suppose the voyage were to be a very far one, such as we had not dreamed that we might undertake." All the wrinkles in Timothy Tripp's brown face puckered up in a smile of delight. "A far voyage," he repeated. "Ah, that would be worthy of the Jocasta indeed. I have stopped so long ashore in these last months that I am ready now to sail the whole world round." "But Henrietta," Michael reminded him. "How will it be to keep Henrietta waiting so long?" Timothy's smile did not vanish, but broadened wickedly. "It will do Henrietta no harm to wait a little," he remarked, "after all the years she has kept me double-reefed lover." The quick darkness of nightfall in the tropics was threatening soon to hide that contest of speed which they were watching. The wind freshened in a sudden gust, before which both the hunter and the hunted dipped dangerously, but neither of them would shorten sail. The long swells over which the Jocasta was moving so easily began to be agitated into a restless, choppy sea. Timothy Tripp, looking across at the darkening horizon, said, "It is past the season for hurricanes, but it is my belief there is something very like one coming out of its turn to speed those two even faster on their way. I wonder which will take in her canvas first." "Look!" cried Michael, pointing suddenly. A dark, flitting shape had crossed the wake of the first of the racing vessels, It was still light enough to make out the low, black hull and the single long-pointed sail. It was a piragua, the native boat used by the Carib Indians. Michael had seen them many times gliding in and out of the harbors or slipping from island to island, and knew that their bold, cinnamon-colored sailors often ventured upon perilous voyages in them, even to the mainland of Mexico and Central America. They were made from a single roughly hewn dugout log, split in two with a flat bottom of heavy planking to give greater beam, and with a rude lee-board thrust over the side to prevent their capsizing when the lateen sail filled with wind. The small craft which he was watching now was beating into the wind, and seemed as determined to keep upon her course as was the flying cutter which was bearing down upon her. The three vessels each had its own urgent errand, from which apparently not one of them would give way. "The Englishman will never alter her course to a point to spare a Carib water-bug," remarked Tripp, straining his eyes in the swiftly gathering gloom. "There, he is upon her. Will they win clear? No, they have struck." For a moment the little Indian vessel was hidden from sight under the bows of the cutter. Then she crawled into view once more, staggering in the rising wind, plainly disabled and unable to hold her course. The British vessel sped steadily upon its own way. The wind had swooped down upon it. Very reluctantly, so it seemed, that last sail, the Angel's Wing, was being furled. Michael slid from his place and went clambering downward. Every brace and block of the Yocasta's rigging was singing and creaking, and the place for the second officer was at his proper station, on the deck below. The wind had fallen upon them so suddenly that for a little there was no time for thought of anything but the rapid furling of the sails. The Yocasta, instead of her stately rising and dipping, was now bucking and rolling, with great splashes of spray rattling down upon her deck, as she sped forward under close-reefed canvas. Timothy Tripp had found Michael's side after comparative quiet had replaced the tumult of orders and the sound of running feet. "Yonder is the Indian," he said, pointing over the leeward rail. "See how low in the water they lie? The boat is certain to founder before she can make land. 'Tis a pity to see bold sailors go down, no matter what sort of craft they navigate." Michael caught one glimpse of the native boat being flung up and down in the heavy seas as helplessly as though she were a winged duck. He swung about and ran to where Captain Douglas stood beside the wheel. "Lower a boat!" the captain exclaimed in response to his breathless request. "That is a perilous thing in this rising tempest. You will have to ask for volunteers." The words were not out of his mouth before there were voices at Michael's elbow. "I am here," announced Timothy Tripp and 10 other men at the same moment. The rescue party from the Yocasta pulled across the steadily mounting waves until the longboat came so close as to being tossing on the crest of one wave, while the heavy piragua lurched and staggered over the summit of the next. Michael shouted across the intervening space and made signs to the 2 brown navigators that they were to make ready to jump aboard the longboat the moment she came alongside of them. For answer, one of the Indians swung their vessel about as though in panic-stricken effort to escape, while the other, leaning over the broken side where the cutter had crushed in the whole length of the gunwale, shouted in return a few Indian words whose evident message was rage and defiance. "Does the fellow take us for pirates?" exclaimed the seaman who pulled the oar nearest to Michael's place. "You would think his vessel was laden with gold, she lies so heavy in the water, and her crew seems so shy of letting us come nigh her. Ah, will you see that?" The Carib's rotten sail had carried away and was now whipping in a fringe of tattered rags from the single spar, while the boat slid into the trough of the wave and wallowed helpless. One of the men, overcome by terror, was cowering in her bottom, but the other, still undaunted, perched upon her pitching stern and tried by means of the clumsy tiller to bring her back into her course again. "Now give way," Michael ordered, and the longboat dropped down the heaving slope and lay alongside the piragua. The sterns of the 2 small vessels swung almost together, and the Carib Indian, suddenly rising in his place, seized the heavy paddle and struck at Michael with determined and terrific force. Had not the sailor next to him jerked up his oar at the same instant, Michael might have been brained where he sat. As it was, the swing of the long blade not only parried the blow, but swept the Carib from his place, so that he plunged overboard into the tossing sea. "Let the fellow drown," roared the seaman. "Why seek to save such a pair of murderous brown devils as these?" But Michael's obstinacy was completely aroused. They had set out to rescue these 2 who had made so bold and skillful a battle for life, and rescued they should be. The head of the Indian overboard now showed round and black in the water astern. Timothy Tripp in the bow had flung a grappling hook which had caught in the forward thwarts of the piragua and had swung the vessel round a helpless tow. A lashing rain had begun to fall, drenching and blinding them as they tried to peer into the gloom. "The fellow took the paddle with him and is still clinging to it," shouted Tripp as their bow spun round and passed within a boat's length of the man in the water. The stern swung nearer to him so that Michael, reaching far over, actually laid hand upon the paddle by which the man was floating. With a grip of iron fingers the Indian caught his arm and tore loose his rescuer's grasp, just as a great heaving wave swept him past into the darkness. He had relinquished his hold upon the paddle, which now floated idly in the wake of the longboat. "His comrade has him!" cried one of the oarsmen suddenly. The heavy dugout, jerking dead weight behind the Yocasta's longboat, had swept to the same course over the crest of the wave, and the remaining Indian, leaning far over her stern, had snatched at his struggling comrade as he went whirling by. They could see his slow effort to drag on board the half-unconscious man. "I believe he is safe," declared the seaman beside Michael, "and now it's as though we had hooked 2 live sharks on the end of a line and had nothing very good to do with them." The 2 Caribs, however, seemed sodden with exhaustion and made no further resistance even when their little vessel was towed alongside the Yocasta, was hoisted out of the water, and fairly deposited upon the deck of the ship. Not even then did they move or speak, but crouched together like 2 wild animals, dangerous and sullen. Men came crowding about with lanterns, for the great question amongst them all had been, what was the heavy lading of that small craft which her owners would not abandon? "You would have thought she was a Spanish galleon with her hold full of bar silver," said Timothy Tripp, thrusting a hand into the curious white substance with which the dugout was half filled. "Shells!" he ejaculated as he held his palm to the red light of the lantern. "They have risked their lives and ours for a cargo of little curlicue shells?" He gave over the handful to Michael, who examined them in his turn, turning them over carefully, the frail, conically twisted shells of some small sea snail. He examined them for some moments in absorbed silence, then motioned to have the lantern lifted until it shone directly upon the lowering, hostile face of the big Carib Indian. With his other hand he drew from his pocket a handful of silver coins and held them out so that the red light fell upon a Spanish dollar, a few shillings, and 3 or 4 of the misshapen bits of silver which the West Indians call cross money. "How much?" he said briefly. Whether such words were spoken in English or French, Spanish or Dutch, the natives of the islands all knew their meaning. The light of a slow smile spread across that countenance which a moment before had seemed like a carved mask of defiant hatred. The Carib's eyes glittered and his white teeth shone. From the coins spread out on Michael's palm he took one of the pieces of cross money, handed it to his comrade, then, thrusting both hands into the mass of shells, he held them out to Michael. The man was a trader, just as they were, although the wares which he carried to market seemed so strange and useless to more civilized eyes. Michael, however, received the product of his purchase gravely and carried it away to the cabin, where he spread it upon the table. Captain Douglas and Charles Brigham, the first mate, had come below with him and now stood staring in wonder, first at him, then at the tiny white shells scattered in the light of the swinging lamp. "What strange folly is this, Mr. Slade?" the captain asked. "Sit down," said Michael. "You of New England do not know as much of Indian ways as I do. This is, to Indian eyes, what refined gold would be to ours. They call it true wampum. Many people have learned to designate by the name of wampum almost any form of the beads or shells which pass amongst the Indians for money. The tribes of Massachusetts would cut and bore the thick shells of the quahog clam. Others would use whatever material came most readily to hand. With incomplete understanding, the white men have called all of these beads wampum, but are mistaken in doing so. The narrow, pointed shells, which are picked up in quantity along the coast of Central America, readily pierced for stringing and easily colored, made up the first wampum used by the Indians, and all the other sorts have been a mere makeshift. By trade and plunder it has been carried over the whole of the American continent. There is no tribe, no matter how remote, which does not have at least a single precious handful of it hoarded amongst the choicest treasures of the richest chief. Strings and belts of it are used to make record of the most solemn treaties. Beads and bright ornaments, horses and brass kettles, by all of these the different Indian tribes measure their outward standard of wealth, but the true wampum is the rarest treasure in the eyes of them all. This information Michael had picked up by chance amongst his friends the Seminoles. The odd fancies of childlike savages do not often linger in the minds of busy men, so that many who had heard of the same thing had straightway forgotten it. Once, when Michael was a boy of 12, a Seminole chief had shown him a richly worked quiver of arrows, whose cover was embroidered with bright-colored porcupine quills in the pattern of running buffalo. The man had told him vaguely that it came from very far away, from beyond a great river and from near its upper waters, where ice would bind the stream for many moons of the year. To the Seminole, the region was as remote as the land of trolls or goblins might be. When Michael asked him how such a thing could have traveled so far, the Indian had shown him a handful of the little shells and had said, "This go just as far, that come back." The fact had remained in his mind as evidence that the trading between tribe and tribe extended far more widely than any white man dreamed. All this Michael explained to the other two below the swaying light in the Yocasta's cabin. These two Carib Indians evidently made regular voyages to gather the shell, which they exchanged amongst their kind for coconuts, fish, and turtle eggs, and which they sold in turn to the white men. The cinnamon trader in his palm-thatched hut was as well established a merchant as Raoul La Roquet himself in his big counting-house, with its heavy mahogany furniture and its gold mirrors and satin-cushioned chairs brought out from France. "For a little cross-money we can buy the man's whole cargo," Michael said. Cross-money was made up of the old Spanish coins, clipped and battered almost beyond recognition, but still bearing stamped on their surface the cross or the royal arms which showed that they had once been of official value. Such rude wealth seemed to appeal far more to the Indian mind than the bewildering variety of doubloons, Spanish dollars, or pieces of 8, and louis d'or of more established shape and workmanship. "But why would we want to buy it?" demanded Charles Brigham. "Because," Michael answered slowly, looking across at Captain Douglas, "if we should ever have any wish to trade with Indians, either in the islands or on more remote coasts, this is the medium of exchange laid ready to our hands." Charles Brigham uttered an exclamation of angry protest and rose from beside the table. "If your talk is coming back to that, I will have done with you," he said. "I have heard all these wild words concerning the voyage of the Columbia, and how you and Captain Douglas have her ever in your minds. If you wish to go chasing a phantom of fortune in some region beyond nowhere, be it understood that I remain behind to find a sober passage home, or to some port where sailors, not madmen, are wont to fare." A sudden stagger of the ship under increased onslaughts of the wind put a summary end to further discussion and sent them all three on deck. The storm raged through the night, but had blown itself out by morning, after carrying them well on their way to Basseterre. The two Indians, once comprehending that they were not to be robbed, seemed delighted to complete their passage home on the Yocasta. They were not natives of the island of Haiti, as it had first appeared, but belonged to that group of scattered islets, some of them scarcely yet named, in the neighborhood of Guadalupe and Dominica. For them it was a long and dangerous voyage to the mainland of Central America, but with their knowledge of winds and currents they would creep from island to island, from one small rocky cay to another, making the voyage several times in a year for the sake of the profit which it brought them. By means of a rough code of signs and a few greatly garbled French and Spanish words, they managed to give much information as to reefs and channels. This was of the greatest usefulness as the Yocasta began to take her way cautiously from one harbor to another of that crescent-shaped scattering of rocks, palms, and mountain peaks which made up the Windward and Leeward Islands. More than once the Carib trader, by means of such method as he could muster, indicated to Michael that before they parted he would be glad to exchange his whole cargo of shell for whatever sum the white man would be willing to offer. But Michael would shake his head, since no decision in that matter had yet been reached. They were lying at anchor one still, hot evening in the landlocked harbor of a small island, San Cristobal, between Dominica and Martinique. The next morning their Carib passengers were to leave them, to finish the voyage to whatever handful of rocks and nodding palms it was which they actually called home. Michael had completed his business in the little town which lay buried in green foliage close to the edge of the water. He had brought to an end the last of their errands, having to do with the disposal of their cargo, so that, when they cleared again, it would be for return to Port-au-Prince. The green encircled harbor was like a looking-glass, with a reflection of trees fringing its edge, and with the images of a ship or two besides the Yocasta mirrored on its still surface. From a French vessel of old-fashioned build there came across to them the sound of slow, chanted music. Michael stood leaning against the rail of the afterdeck, idle, dreaming and listening. It was so hot in the cabin below that Captain Douglas had brought up a roll of charts and papers and was sitting on a gear chest, with the maps spread out before him, bending forward to catch the last of the daylight, now almost gone. Charles Brigham, officially on watch, was walking slowly up and down. He also was stopping now and again to hearken to the singing, whose sound spread far abroad above the still waters. An old seaman, William Tuttle, had been telling Michael a quantity of tales having to do with the great naval battles all up and down the West Indies, where French, Spanish, English, and Dutch had contended for the mastery, and by which the different islands had changed hands again and again. French and Spanish fleets had at various times taken refuge in this same bay, battered and wounded after some great struggle. Amongst the ships of Roman Catholic nations it was the custom, when they were lying in harbor, for the crew to muster at sunset, standing in a half-circle before the image of Our Lady of the Sea set high in the stern, and to sing a hymn to her as the light began to fade, that same hymn which was sounding now in a slow chant across the bay. It was not difficult for Michael to think how the music must have come drifting from those scarred and battered Spanish vessels, and how, just as darkness fell, they saluted one another, according to custom, with a blast of silver trumpets. It seemed as though it was the dreamed-of sound of those same silver trumpets which went with him through all the adventures which were to follow that peaceful hour. Captain Douglas had also been lost in some vision of his own, for he had sat without moving for some time, the charts still spread before him, although it was so dark he could have made out nothing upon them. Now, however, he turned about and summoned Michael and Charles Brigham to him. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we turn about upon our course to return to Port-au-Prince, and from there—" He did not go on, for the discussion as to the next portion of their voyage had not yet been carried to an end. Many times talk had waxed hot in the cabin, and the three had struggled in argument over the whole range of possible venture. The final decision lay by right between the captain and Michael, as the master of the ship and the representative of the owners. But the steady resistance of Charles Brigham to what he called the mad project, which was in the minds of the other two, had been a check upon Captain Douglas's making up his mind. Impulse was driving him one way, and prudence another. Neither Michael's fiery and visionary persuasions, nor Charles Brigham's cold, steady disbelief could hasten him to his final judgment. Now postponement was no longer possible. Here in these still waters, in the dead silence of the breathless dusk, they must determine what storms and seas the Jocasta was to face, what strange shores and what far ports she was to see. When Captain Douglas invited the renewal of the argument, each of the two younger men seemed more firmly established in his own belief than ever. "Every day," Charles Brigham said hotly to Michael, "I see you pull out of your pocket that handful of shells and stand looking at them as though that Carib Indian had thrown one of his witch-doctor spells upon you. Will you never have done with such trifling and turn your mind to the purposes for which this ship sets sail?" "And what were those purposes?" Michael returned with equal vehemence. "To carry a cargo to market by established routes only, lest by chance there should be aught of danger or risk of loss? To take the way followed by 1,000 ships before us? To accept the rulings, the forbiddance, and the confiscation which lords in council, kings, and petty princes choose to lay upon us? Shall the whole world say that American trade can do no more than this, to stand humbly waiting in overcrowded ports and take what the others leave?" Back and forth the contention went, the captain saying little, the two hot-heads saying much. At last, more for want of breath than for their having silenced each other, Michael and Charles Brigham ceased speaking. The captain's face was hidden in the gloom, nor could either of them guess what he was thinking. They were waiting for him, but finally, unable to keep silent, Michael burst out again. "Ah," he cried, "if only Nicholas Drury were here!" Captain Douglas turned towards him with sudden directness. "If he were here, what do you think he would say?" "I do not need to think. I know," cried Michael. "He would say, 'Turn your backs on those jostling places of trade where there is never-ending combat for the first place, and where men must hate each other because they are too many.' He would say that if some new route offered, some way to extend trade rather than to take it away from others, then thither should the Jocasta sail. It was for that he built her." "Can you give me your word, Michael, that this is the truth?" the captain insisted, and the boy answered simply, "My word of honor, sir, that this is so. There are no secrets between Nicholas Drury and me. Each of us knew what was in the other's heart when we set our hands to this task. Very slowly and reflectively, Captain Douglas spoke. There must always be men to try out new ways, or the world would never go forward. In the long pause which followed, Charles Brigham shifted from one foot to the other, opened his lips as though to speak, then closed them again. It was as though he, with the other two, was seeing the same vision, of Magellan feeling his way through those stormy straits, which were evermore to be his own, of Cabral tossed and wind-buffeted, the sport of adverse tempests which carried him within view of an unknown tropical country of unmeasured riches, of Drake slipping into his home port, weary, battered, and triumphant, all the way around the world in the little Golden Hind, and back safe to Devon at last. In that space of quiet, Charles Brigham knew himself beaten. It was he who broke the silence. "I can see," he declared, "that your minds are made up at last." "Yes," Captain Douglas answered him. "The minds of all of us seem to have come to their decision. You are the best first officer I have ever had, Mr. Brigham. I shall be loath to lose you." Charles Brigham turned his head to look forward along the deck, where the clean, graceful lines of the ship narrowed to the bows, their final lift being lost in shadows. He glanced upward at her towering masts, the upper spars shrouded in the velvet darkness. He swallowed hard and spoke briefly. "A man who has once sailed on the Jocasta does not lightly leave her for another. I go where she goes." "Good!" cried Michael. The captain was fumbling with a roll of papers upon his knee. "Michael," he said, "bring a lantern." The three bent close in the narrow illumination as Captain Douglas spread out his maps. The first was of the coast of Spain, France, and the Mediterranean, covered thick with names of ports, of boundaries, and of principalities, the close-crowded, divided region where remorseless competition and warring interest had again and again locked in deadly combat through the whole tale of history. "Not this," he said, and unrolled the other. Here was a map very different, with long stretches of seacoast almost unmarked by a name, with lines of capes and bays so vaguely drawn that it was evidently only hearsay which had given information for that charting of the long sweep of South America, and the upward-reaching Pacific shore of two continents. Whalers seeking their quarry in southern seas, Russian hunters at the north, a very few English ships taking back their way eastward from China, and back again, had brought back scanty information that here was a harbor, there an island, there a stretch of iron-bound cliff, no man knew how many 100 miles long. It was like a map of another world for which only legend and fancy had drawn the charts. Captain Douglas's finger was running downward from the West Indies out around the curve of Brazil. "Here is Rio," he was saying, "and here is Montevideo." His finger went down and down, out of the tropics, through the steady, temperate regions, down to the stormy, unfettered seas where all land ends. "And here is Cape Horn." End of chapter 8.